So here we are at the last part of SL equilibrium that we need to be looking at, and that is taking everything that we've learned about equilibrium and applying it to industrial processes. So looking at how this applies to the real world and how equilibrium influences the industrial production of different chemicals. So essentially, all of this is talking about our reliance on industry to produce chemical products. So this can be for cleaning agents, it could be for pharmaceuticals, it could be as precursors for other industry, plastics, minerals, anything like that. So we manufacture a huge amount of chemicals in our everyday lives, and essentially, depending on what they are, but for the most part, as with all economic processes, we want them to be made as cheaply and quickly as possible. Generally, they're made in very large quantities, so we're looking, instead of the gram quantities that we look at within our own lab environment, we're looking at things like thousands of kilograms and tons of material. And the other thing is, of course, considering safety considerations when we look at these. So since we've learnt from Le Chatelier's principle that we can actually alter the position of equilibrium from where it sits at a particular temperature, we can ensure that we maximize these factors. So we want to be able to maximize the extent of the reaction, because this will give us a higher percentage yield. Okay, so talking about the percentage yield that we get, and we also want to be able to maximize the rate. So yield is going to be linked to our extent of reaction, so our Kc and equilibrium position, and the rate, of course, is how quickly something is going to be produced over time. Again, we look at our Haber process, in this case for the production of ammonia. It's not essential for you to learn each of these industrial processes and how they're made off by heart, but you should be able to apply the principles of equilibrium to any process that you may be shown in an exam question. So we've talked about this before, in that ammonia is produced by the Haber process according to this reaction here, which is a homogeneous gas reaction. It is an exothermic reaction producing 92.4 kilojoules per mole of energy. So if we think about this, we know it's exothermic. We know it's a gaseous reaction, so there's a number of ways that we can maximize the equilibrium yield for this, which is to say by pushing the reaction to favor the products or favoring the right-hand side. It's exothermic, so we know that in order to increase Kc and push the reaction to the right, we want to decrease temperature. It is a gaseous reaction, so we can also look at pressure. And if we consider the situation here, we have 4 particles on the reactant side and 2 particles on the product side. So if we increase pressure, we will actually also favor the product. And the other way, of course, is if we actually add extra reactant or remove product as it's formed. And these are actually considerations that we see happening in the actual process. So we can increase the concentration of N2 or H2, which is adding our reactant. We can remove ammonia as it forms, which is removing our product, which will therefore favor the right-hand side, increase the pressure or decrease the temperature. If we think about this, we need to consider the potential problems with each of these. If particular, decreasing the temperature will decrease our rate of reaction, so that's not something we necessarily want in industrial process to make it go slower. Increasing the pressure is always very costly. It's also very risky. Okay, it's quite dangerous to increase pressure. It has a high cost associated with it. And as we said on the first slide, one of our considerations is safety, and anything done under a high pressure at a fairly high temperature is quite risky. Okay, so that does leave us with adding in N2 or H2, which will decrease our atom economy or our efficiency. Removing ammonia, sometimes possible, sometimes not, depending on the situation that we're looking at. But with this one, we can actually remove ammonia. So if we have a look at the actual conditions that we use for the Haber process, in order to have a rapid rate, we need to run at a fairly high temperature with a high concentration of gases, and we use a catalyst, remembering that the catalyst will only affect our rate, it won't affect our equilibrium position. Okay, and then we make sure that that catalyst has a high surface area. For things to maximize yield, we want to have a low temperature, we want to have high pressure as well, and the catalyst won't have an effect. So if we look at the actual conditions, we have a relatively low temperature, and while 400 to 450 degrees C may not seem like a low temperature to us, for industry it is actually quite a low temperature. We run at 200 atmospheres, which again is a manageable pressure. It's not actually very high. Okay, and we definitely do use a catalyst. So there's a trade-off here that we see between rate and equilibrium position or yield, which is often the case with industrial processes, where there has to be some kind of consideration or trade-off between the equilibrium. So do we go for more yield and a slower rate, or do we push for the rate and sacrifice a little bit of the yield? So this is the way that the Haber process is actually done. It has a heating coil here, which increases the temperature and it loads the gases in preheated that pass through the catalyst bed. This heat exchanger then drops the temperature and the gases are pumped through to the other reactor. Okay, we recycle unreacted N2 and H2, and the refrigeration unit actually causes ammonia to liquefy. If you think about this, you should be able to relate this to bonding, in that ammonia is able to form hydrogen bonds. It'll have a lower boiling temperature, a higher boiling temperature than N2 and H2, which means N2 and H2 will still be gases when ammonia starts to liquefy. So this is the way that we can actually remove the product as it goes, because we can actually pull out liquid ammonia, recycle the N2 and H2 back into the system. Okay, so again, you don't need to know the exact conditions, but you should be able to look at a diagram like this and explain what's happening. So the removal of the product here, the use of temperature, and apply equilibrium positions to considerations to that. The other one that is common to turn up in questions is sulfuric acid. So we use sulfuric acid a lot in Australia to form superphosphate fertilizers. It's used in the production of paints, dyes. It's used as catalyst in organic synthesis for medicines. It's one of the world's most produced chemicals. It's produced by a process we call the contact process. Again, it's a highly exothermic reaction and undergoes via 3 stages. These days we tend to use SO2 that is given off by byproducts from the burning of coal. That SO2 is recaptured and then used for the production of sulfuric acid. It can also be produced by burning elemental sulfur, but largely in order to reduce the environmental considerations of coal-fired power plants and fossil fuels, we can capture the SO2 and then filter that back through into a production facility for sulfuric acid. It's then reacted with oxygen to form SO3. SO3 is actually reacted with sulfuric acid to form something we call oleum, because if we were to just generate sulfuric acid directly, it would be another highly exothermic reaction and we'd end up in a highly dangerous vapor of sulfuric acid. So this is largely for a safety concern. Then that is then reacted with water to produce 2 lots of H2SO4. So we use 1, but we produce 2. So overall we've got a net production of sulfuric acid. So if we think about this again, we've got an exothermic reaction. We want to decrease the temperature. In the case of these, we have some gaseous reactions and some liquid gas reactions, so we don't always have homogeneous reactions, and we can use a catalyst to increase the rate. So if we look at this, we could increase the concentration of our reactants. We could remove SO3 as it forms as a product in the first step. We could increase the pressure on our gaseous step, because you'll notice that if we go here in the gases, increasing the pressure will drive it towards our product. Or we can decrease the temperature. Again, decreasing the temperature is going to decrease the rate of reaction. Increasing the pressure, particularly when we're talking hot acids, is going to be highly risky and take a lot of energy. So if we have a look, for a rapid rate, we want high temperature, high concentration because it'll increase the frequency of collisions, and a catalyst. For a high yield or pushing the equilibrium position to the right, we would actually favour a low temperature. High pressure would still work for that, and then the catalyst has no effect. What we actually do is look to minimize costs. So keeping a lower temperature minimize costs because temperature requires energy and that's quite expensive industrially. Concentration is actually kept quite low and it's done at atmospheric pressure for safety considerations, and the rate stays fairly reasonable. And then we use the cheapest catalyst available. So it's done at 400 degrees C. Atmospheric pressure, so 1 atmosphere or 100 kilopascals, and we use vanadium oxide as the catalyst again here. This is the contact process. So as I said, it can be done through elemental sulfur. So they take molten sulfur, dry it, purify it because we want to remove the water, or it can be taken from the desulfurization of fossil fuels. Passed through what we call the converter, which is where all the catalyst beds are. Okay, reacted, the oleum is then diluted to form sulfuric acid in the absorption tower, and sulfuric acid is gotten out the bottom as well as used up the top. Again, you don't need to know these off by heart, just be able to apply the principles of equilibrium to them. So these questions will help you go through that a little bit, but just remembering the key thing that we're looking at here is the trade-off between rate and yield, okay? And yield links directly to our equilibrium position. Okay, so when we are trying to increase yield, we want to favor the products. We want to push the reaction through to the right. And that's it for industrial considerations.